The city was alive, pulsing with energy as evening descended, casting a golden glow over the streets of Portland, Maine. The air was thick with the scent of fresh seafood, drifting out from the high-end restaurants that dotted the cobblestone sidewalks of the Old Port District. Among these culinary landmarks stood Monarch Bistro, a place renowned for its exclusivity and refined dining experience. The windows shimmered softly under warm, inviting lights, and the quiet hum of conversation and clinking glasses filled the air, giving the impression of a venue where reservations were as precious as gold. Inside, however, the atmosphere was surprisingly calm. Fewer tables were occupied than usual, and the soft murmur of diners blended seamlessly with the distant melody of a piano playing in the background. The host, a young woman with sharp features and an air of indifference, stood at the podium, scrolling intently through her tablet. The bistro's glass doors swung open, and in walked a tall, well-dressed black man, his charcoal suit impeccably tailored, polished shoes catching the dim light with each deliberate step. He paused, surveying the room with an air of quiet confidence, before making his way toward the host. "Good evening," he said, his voice warm and polite, carrying a slight trace of authority. "I'd like a table for one." The host barely acknowledged him, her eyes flicking only momentarily to his face before darting back to her tablet. Her brow furrowed ever so slightly as she processed his request. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her tone curt, almost mechanical. "No," he replied, his voice unruffled. "But it looks like you've got plenty of space." He gestured subtly toward the half-empty room, his gaze steady, unwavering. The host pursed her lips, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the screen, as she glanced over her shoulder at a colleague, before leaning in slightly toward the man. "I'm sorry," she said flatly, "but we're fully booked tonight." For a moment the man stood frozen, his gaze fixed on her face, studying her every feature. His expression remained stoic, but a fleeting spark of something, disappointment perhaps or something deeper, flickered in his eyes. He said nothing in protest. Instead, with a small measured nod, he offered a simple, "Thank you for your time," before turning to leave. The faint murmur of whispers followed him, as he made his way back to the door. One waiter leaned toward another, his voice low, tinged with judgment. "He doesn't look like the type to dine here, does he?" The other waiter chuckled softly, shaking his head in agreement. Outside, the man paused on the sidewalk, pulling out his phone. His demeanor remained calm, almost calculated, as he typed something quickly. After a moment, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned away, his footsteps fading into the symphony of the city's nighttime rhythm. Inside the bistro, life continued as usual. Plates were served, glasses of wine were refilled, and laughter echoed through the air, blending with the soft clink of silverware. No one paid much attention to the brief exchange at the door, but if they had, they might have noticed something in the man's departure. A quiet assurance lingered around him, an unspoken certainty, as if he knew deep down that the story wasn't over. As the man disappeared into the night, the staff at Monarch Bistro returned to their usual routines. Yet, despite the outward calm, a strange tension lingered in the air, like the aftertaste of something unsaid. The host, Lauren, leaned against the podium, her gaze fixed on the screen of her tablet, but her mind was elsewhere. "Who even shows up here without a reservation?" she muttered under her breath, clearly unsettled. Behind her, a waiter named Ethan folded a crisp white napkin, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Seriously, did you see his suit? Not exactly our typical clientele." Lauren shrugged, offering a dismissive laugh. "Maybe he thought he could charm his way in. Happens all the time." The other staff exchanged knowing glances, a subtle but clear reinforcement of a shared assumption. They didn't speak it outright, but the unspoken sentiment was loud enough for anyone to hear. The man had been an anomaly, someone who didn't quite fit the image they had crafted for their elite clientele. In the kitchen, the sous chef, Rebecca, was plating a dish when she overheard the murmurs drifting in from the dining room. Wiping her hands on her apron, she stepped closer to the swinging door, catching snippets of the conversation. "Come on, you guys," she interjected, her voice firm enough to quiet the chatter. "You don't know anything about him. Maybe he's someone important." Ethan let out a sarcastic laugh, his tone dripping with mockery. "Yeah, sure. Maybe he's a CEO or something." Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing more. She turned back to her station, her thoughts simmering alongside the dish she was preparing. Over the years at Monarch Bistro, she had seen this kind of casual dismissal before, and it always left a bitter taste in her mouth. At the bar, a couple seated nearby had overheard parts of the conversation. The woman, a sharp-eyed professional in her mid-30s, leaned toward her companion, her voice low but inquisitive. "Did you catch that?" she asked. "The guy they turned away. He looked important." Her date shrugged, swirling his wine in his glass. "Doesn't matter. This place has a reputation for being selective." "Selective?" she repeated, an eyebrow arched in disbelief. "You mean snobbish?" He chuckled, his tone casual, as if he didn't mind the implication. "Call it what you want. That's part of the appeal, isn't it?" The woman frowned but didn't respond, instead turning her attention back to her scallops. Their conversation faded into the background, becoming just another thread in the intricate fabric of the restaurant's evening hours. Hours later, as Monarch Bistro closed for the night, Lauren recounted the incident to the owner, Stephen Harper. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair, and a sharp business sense. Stephen had built Monarch Bistro from the ground up, shaping its reputation around exclusivity and prestige. "Just another walk-in," Lauren said nonchalantly, brushing it off as she locked the front door. "Nothing out of the ordinary." Stephen nodded, distracted, his attention focused on reviewing the night's earnings. "Good. We have an image to maintain." Neither of them gave the man a second thought as they finished their tasks and left the restaurant. But what they didn't know was that the brief encounter at the door had set something far bigger in motion. Something that would soon shake the carefully constructed facade of Monarch Bistro. 3 days later, Stephen sat in his office, sipping his morning coffee as sunlight streamed through the large windows. It was his usual routine: check emails, review reservations, and scan for any media mentions of Monarch Bistro. The restaurant had earned glowing reviews in the past, solidifying its place as one of Portland's finest. But today, as he scrolled through his inbox, one subject line caught his eye. It made him stop cold. "Fine dining or fine discrimination?" Stephen's stomach knotted. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, unwilling to face the truth. The screen blinked before him, the article loading slowly, as if prolonging the inevitable. Christopher Ellis, a name he knew well too well, appeared at the top of the page. Ellis was more than just a critic. He was a force capable of bringing down empires with a few well-chosen words. And now, those words were about to hit Monarch Bistro like a freight train. Stephen clicked open the link. He read, his coffee growing cold and forgotten on his desk, as Ellis's damning review unfolded in front of him. Monarch Bistro is known for its exclusivity. But what happens when exclusivity crosses the line into discrimination? The sentence hit Stephen like a slap. "My recent experience at this restaurant offers a disturbing glimpse." Ellis's recounting of the evening chilled him. "On a quiet evening, I decided to test the hospitality of this establishment without a reservation. Upon arrival, I was promptly turned away by the host, despite the restaurant being noticeably less than full. I observed the subtle glances, the dismissive tone, and the unspoken assumption that I didn't belong." Stephen's mind raced, but he forced himself to continue reading. "I walked away without argument, but not without curiosity. Over the next few days, I ordered several dishes from Monarch Bistro for delivery, anonymously of course. The food was undeniably exquisite, a testament to the talent in the kitchen. However, a dining experience is about more than just food. It's about how a guest is treated from the moment they step through the door. And on that front, Monarch Bistro failed spectacularly. The question is not about reservations or policies. The question is about respect. And in this case, respect was glaringly absent. Fine dining should elevate its patrons, not diminish them. Unfortunately, Monarch Bistro's actions left a sour taste that no dish, no matter how expertly prepared, could erase. Stephen's hands trembled as he scrolled down. The review was already viral, shared thousands of times. Comments flooded in like a tide, demanding accountability. Social media buzzed with hashtags. #MonarchBias and #FoodCriticSpeaks. Even local news outlets had picked up the story. Stephen slammed his hand against the desk, his breath shallow with rising panic. How could this have happened? He had crafted Monarch Bistro's reputation with painstaking care over the years, building it into a symbol of perfection. And now, just like that, with a few words, Christopher Ellis had unraveled it all. Downstairs, the atmosphere had shifted. The phone, which had once rung incessantly with reservation requests, had fallen eerily silent. Lauren, scrolling through her own phone, looked pale, as if the blood had drained from her face. "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Rebecca, the sous chef, leaned against the kitchen counter, reading the same article. Her voice was quiet but firm as she spoke. "It's real." She glanced up from her phone. "And it's not wrong." Ethan, the waiter, scoffed as he wiped down the bar. "Come on, it's just one guy's opinion. It'll blow over." Rebecca shook her head slowly, her expression hardening. Not when it's him. You don't understand. Christopher Ellis is untouchable in this industry. If he says you're done, you're done. By midday, the fallout was undeniable. Reservations for the upcoming days were canceled one by one. The article's poison had spread quickly. One particularly irate patron left a scathing voicemail, calling Monarch Bistro a bastion of snobbery and prejudice. Stephen's phone buzzed relentlessly with texts from friends and colleagues. The same question was echoed in each. What are you going to do about this? He knew that the answer was not simple. This wasn't just a restaurant's reputation at stake. It was the core of everything he had built. Monarch Bistro had become a symbol of something far more ugly than exclusivity. If he didn't act swiftly, the very foundation of his legacy, his livelihood, could crumble within the week. Stephen paced the length of his office, his mind racing in frantic circles. His assistant had tried twice to interrupt, but he waved her off each time, consumed with the weight of the situation. The restaurant's phone lines were eerily silent, and his inbox was flooded with a mix of angry messages and media inquiries. By the end of the day, Monarch Bistro's reviews had dropped from a near-perfect 4.8 to a dismal 2.1 across several platforms. Comments flooded in. Bias has no place in fine dining. They don't deserve your money. Maybe they should learn to treat all their guests with respect. For the first time in years, Stephen felt powerless. He was the architect of Monarch Bistro's success, and now he was watching it unravel before his eyes. The next morning, after hours of soul-searching, Stephen knew he had to act. He drafted a statement, his fingers shaky as they typed the words. He knew he had to respond, but he couldn't escape the feeling that words alone wouldn't suffice. At Monarch Bistro, we have always strived to offer an exceptional dining experience to every guest. Recently, it has been brought to our attention that we failed in this mission. We deeply regret the incident described in Christopher Ellis's review and acknowledge that we fell short in upholding our values of inclusivity and respect. We are committed to learning from this and taking concrete steps to ensure it never happens again. Stephen read it aloud to himself, the words feeling hollow, detached, too sterile for such a serious situation. He deleted it. This wasn't just about saving face. It was about redemption. He realized then that actions spoke louder than any written apology. Later that day, Stephen called for a staff meeting. The employees trickled in, their faces a mixture of nervousness and indifference. Lauren fidgeted with her phone. Ethan leaned against the bar with a smirk, and Rebecca stood by, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Stephen cleared his throat, his voice wavering for the first time. I'm sure you've all seen the article, he began, his eyes scanning the room. And I'm sure you understand how serious this is. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Lauren, however, avoided his gaze, her eyes fixed on the floor. Stephen took a deep breath. I won't sugarcoat it. What happened at the door that night reflects poorly on all of us. But the truth is, this isn't just about one incident. It's about a culture that I allowed to grow here. And for that, I take full responsibility. Rebecca raised an eyebrow, her posture softening slightly. Ethan, however, crossed his arms, a skeptical look on his face. So what's the plan? He asked. We just grovel and hope people come back. Stephen shot him a sharp look. The plan, he said firmly, is to start with an apology. A real one. The following morning, Stephen posted a new statement, accompanied by a video. In it, he addressed Christopher Ellis directly, his voice steady and sincere. To Christopher Ellis and to anyone who has ever felt unwelcome at Monarch Bistro, I want to personally say I'm sorry. Our actions and inaction were wrong. Plain and simple. Fine dining is about more than food. It's about creating an experience that makes every guest feel valued. We failed at that, and for that, I am truly sorry. We are implementing immediate changes, including staff training on bias and inclusivity, because respect and hospitality should be at the heart of everything we do. The words hung in the air, as if the very weight of them pressed against Stephen's chest. He sat in front of the camera, the dim light casting shadows on his face. His voice, steady yet laden with a quiet sorrow, spoke directly to the lens. His words, raw and unrefined, carried a vulnerability that could no longer be hidden. This wasn't polished corporate speak, it was truth laid bare. His eyes, heavy with regret, betrayed the tumultuous emotion simmering within. Within hours, the post started to gain traction. Some readers expressed cautious optimism, commending his sincerity, while others, scarred by the events, remained deeply skeptical. Still, one thing was clear: Stephen was trying. The question that loomed in the air, however, was whether it would be enough. Could a simple apology repair the shattered trust? Could it undo the damage? Determined to do more, Stephen reached out directly to Christopher Ellis. Through the editor of the magazine, he sent a heartfelt email, humbling himself and requesting a face-to-face meeting. He needed the chance to apologize in person, to show the world that he was willing to go the distance. Days passed. Each morning, he opened his inbox with renewed hope, only to be met with emptiness. He wondered if his effort had been in vain. Just when his resolve began to falter, a short reply arrived almost dismissively. "Thank you for your message. While I appreciate your efforts, I must respectfully decline your invitation. My stance remains unchanged. Respect is the foundation of hospitality, and it was absent when it mattered most. I hope this experience will inspire lasting change at Monarch Bistro and beyond." Stephen stared at the screen. The words cut deep, sinking into him like shards of glass. He had hoped for closure, for a chance to mend the fracture. Instead, he was left facing a truth he hadn't wanted to accept. Some wounds, no matter how sincere the apology, were simply too deep to heal. Weeks slipped by, each one more difficult than the last. Monarch Bistro, once a beacon of exclusivity, now felt like a hollow shell. The reservations that once poured in had dwindled to a trickle. The dining room, once alive with conversation and clinking glasses, was often filled with empty chairs that seemed to echo the restaurant's disquiet. The staff, once confident in their roles, moved like shadows, their steps weighed down by the unspoken truth hanging in the air. It wasn't just financial loss that they faced. It was something far more personal. Rebecca, the sous chef, found herself spending more time reflecting on that night, the night they had turned someone away. In the quiet moments between plating orders, she often replayed the incident in her mind. She thought of the man they had turned away, his calm demeanor masking a deeper message. It was never just about getting a table, she whispered to herself one evening. It was about being seen. It was about being respected. Meanwhile, Stephen, desperate to salvage what was left of the reputation he had worked so hard to build, threw himself into action. The fallout had been devastating, but it had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. The exclusivity that once defined Monarch Bistro's allure now felt like a cage, a prison of his own making, a symbol of biases he had been blind to for far too long. He attended workshops, brought in diversity consultants, and implemented mandatory training for all staff. These weren't quick fixes, but rather the painful first steps of a long and uncomfortable journey toward real change. Then one Friday evening, the restaurant was quieter than it had been in months. Only a handful of tables were occupied, the space eerily still. But for Stephen, this felt like an opportunity to rebuild one guest at a time. He stood near the bar, observing the room with quiet intensity when Rebecca approached, her voice hesitant. "There's someone here to see you," she said. Stephen turned, his gaze landing on a man standing near the entrance. It wasn't Christopher Ellis, but someone else. A local community leader Stephen had invited to discuss potential partnerships aimed at making the restaurant more inclusive. Taking a deep breath, he walked over, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming," Stephen said, his tone earnest. "I want to do better. I want Monarch Bistro to be a place that welcomes everyone." The man smiled faintly, but didn't shake his hand right away. "It's a start," he said slowly. "But words are one thing. Actions are another." Stephen nodded. The weight of the statement settled over him, heavy with truth. Trust couldn't be given freely. It had to be earned. And that he knew would take time. Months passed, and Monarch Bistro, while still not as bustling as it once was, began to find its footing again. The dining room, though quieter, was no longer filled with the oppressive silence that had defined those early days. The guests who came now seemed to linger longer, their laughter and conversations filling the space with a warmth that had been missing for so long. Stephen noticed subtle changes among the staff too. Lauren's sharp edges had softened, her once dismissive attitude replaced with a newfound empathy. Ethan, still sarcastic, had become more thoughtful in his interactions with others. And Rebecca, ever steady, had stepped into a more prominent role, her quiet conviction guiding the team with a sense of purpose. One evening, as Stephen closed the restaurant for the night, he glanced at the framed review that had once hung proudly on the wall. It had been removed after Ellis's article, leaving an empty space. That vacant frame now felt symbolic, a reminder of the lessons learned, and of the work that still lay ahead. He thought about the critics' final words, their truth cutting through him like a blade. Respect is the foundation of hospitality. Monarch Bistro had failed that test. But Stephen was determined to rebuild, not on a foundation of exclusivity, but one of inclusivity and integrity. As he turned off the lights and stepped outside, the city hummed with life around him. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be long, but he was ready to walk it, one step at a time.